Hi guys, so for this video we're going to be talking about 180 embossed folds. Now what a 180 embossed fold is quickly is an embossed fold, which means that your image protrudes out from the edge of your page or is embossed on the edge of the page. But also that those tabs that stick out are going to have a 180 fold, which means that they're going to be folded back 180 degrees in order to double the thickness of that tab. This will help bulk up your design, and it will help make small details within your book folds a lot stronger and a lot cleaner looking, and also a little bit more recognizable most of the time. So what I'm noticing the biggest issue with a 180 embossed fold is people are having issues with their embossed tabs kind of opening up. Like, these tabs themselves don't want to hold themselves closed once you fold them 180. And then you get multiple tabs together once you create your image. And when you stand your book up and you look at the image, that these tabs are continuously opening. So when you get into a really small image with small details, these tabs tend to kind of push on each other, and it can actually distort your image. They don't tend to hold themselves in place, and you end up using either glue or tape most of the time to hold your tabs in place. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that, but I do think that there's an easier, better way of holding your tabs. And the way that I'm going to show you how to do that today is going to be just using different depths when you're scoring your book for your 180 fold to get these tabs to actually hold themselves in place. All right, so for an embossed 180, we're going to need to score a book at two depths. We're going to have a deeper depth score line, which is going to act as the background layer for our image. And then we're going to need a shallower score mark that is going to act as our point of folding for our 180 embossed tabs. So that's going to be the depth that we fold our tabs to. So we need to decide the deeper layer first, or the deeper score line first, and what depth we're going to use for that. Now, when you're choosing your depth for your background layer or your deeper depth score mark, there's a couple things to keep in mind. One is going to be how you want your image to look. Do you want your text to show on that background layer? If so, you're going to need a scoring guide that is going to allow the text to show once you make that score mark, so it scores into your text. If you don't want your text to show for your background layer, then obviously you're going to need to choose something that's more shallow than your margin. Another kind of little aside to this is the deeper that you make your background layer, the deeper that you score for your background layer, the more bulk that your book is going to have. And when you stand your book up, the more rounded that your image is going to look. So again, not a bad thing, just something to keep in mind. And it's a lot of personal preference on how you want your image to look, how rounded you want that finished product to be. So once you've decided on what your background layer depth is going to be, whether it shows text or doesn't show text, or how bulky or rounded you want your background layer to be, then we need to decide from there what the shallower score mark and what depth we're going to fold our tabs to for that actual embossed part of the fold. So for this example, I chose a 1.5 centimeter depth for my background layer, and by doing that, as you can see, it's going to leave the edge of my page without the text showing, which means that I'm going to have a blank background, which I think at this point is what most people prefer, so that's how I'm going to demonstrate it. But again, it doesn't actually matter what this value is or how you decide to fold this. This method will work for any depth. So once you've chosen your background depth, in this case, mine is going to be a 1.5 centimeter. I'm going to show you guys what it looks like to score your tabs at a couple of different depths. And I'm going to show you what I mean by when they overlap versus when they don't. So what I've done here is I've made a couple score marks. I made one at 0.7 centimeters, one at 1 centimeter, and one at 1.2 centimeters. So if I just tuck these out of the way quick, and I fold my odd tabs, which is how you fold an embossed fold, to my background, and then I fold my even tabs to these various depths. So the first one I'm going to fold at 0.7, The second one we're going to fold to 1 centimeter. And then the third one we're going to fold to 1.2 centimeters. And if we drop that kind of page again, that background page, so this is my background layer at 1.5, you can see that 2 out of these 3 tabs are holding themselves in place, and one of them is not. So this 0.7 tab is scored shallow, and it's not actually touching or overlapping the depth for that deeper fold, which means that this tab is never going to hold itself in place. My score mark here at 1 centimeter overlaps my 180 fold there for my background layer, so that's going to hold itself in place. And the same goes for my deeper one at 1.2 here, for my shallower one, but the deepest out of these 3 at 1.2 is also holding itself in place. So this is what we're trying to avoid. This is what we're trying to get to. So that way, when you make your folds, you don't have to add glue or tape to these, because your other tabs and your other things are going to hold themselves in place. Now, the next thing that you're going to ask is, before we start our project and we're scoring our book, how do we know what depths are going to overlap each other? So once you've decided what your deepest depth is, we're going to use a formula to figure out what depths will overlap each other and which ones won't. This is the formula that we're going to use in order to figure out if our depths are going to overlap each other. So we're going to go back to middle school a little bit here, and we're going to use some greater or less than. So what this is going to mean, our S is going to stand for our shallow depth. So that's going to be the one that's the least amount from the edge of the page, or our tab depth. And then the D is going to stand for the deeper depth, or the background layer depth that we're going to choose. So to make this statement true, again, going back to middle school, this is the greater than logo, or symbol rather, meaning that this mouth here, if you think about this symbol as a mouth, it's going to want to eat the bigger number. So when we take the depth of our shallow score mark, we want that number to be greater than the difference between the two. So if we take the depth of our deeper score mark, which is in our case 1.5, and we subtract our shallow value, whatever that number is, we want the regular shallow value to be bigger than whatever this difference is. So to show you guys kind of what that looks like. So when we plug in some values into this equation here, this is what it's going to look like. So we're going to start off by plugging in our 1.5 for our deepest depth, because we know that that's not going to change. We're trying to figure out our shallow depth here, but we know that that 1.5 is kind of set in stone because that's where we want our background layer to be. So I've plugged in 1.5, and we're going to test these 3 values to show you guys what that looks like. So we're going to start with 0.7. So if I plug in 0.7 into this equation where my S's are for my shallow depth, so my deep depth is 1.5, my shallow depth is 0.7, is this statement going to be true? And that's what we're looking for. So is 0.7 greater than 1.5 minus 1.7? So if I move my little card down here, so this is what it looks like. 1.5 minus 0.7 is 0.8. So is this true? Is 0.7 greater than 0.8? And the answer is no. So if this statement is not true, then we know that this combination of score marks or depths is not going to work. So let's try it with the next set. So my next depth was 1 centimeter. So if I plug that in, I put my deepest depth as 1.5, and we're going to try a 1 centimeter. So I put 1 for both of my shallows and the 1.5 for my deep. And that's going to look like this. So 1, and then the difference between these, 1.5 minus 1, is 0.5. So is 1 greater than my 0.5? And the answer is yes. 1 is bigger than 0.5. So I know that because this statement is true, that this tab is going to hold itself down. And last but not least, we're going to do the same thing one more time with the 1.2 tab. So again, we plugged 1.5 in for a deep depth and 1.2 in for our shallow depths. And 1.5 minus 1.2 is 0.3. 1.2 is in fact greater than 0.3, which means that this is also a true statement, which means that my tab is also going to hold itself in place. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to want to talk about is, now we know that we have two different depths that are going to work, that our tabs themselves are going to overlap and they're going to hold themselves in place. The next logical question is going to be, well, which one's better? Which one do I choose? Do I go with the 1 centimeter or do I go with the 1.2 centimeter? And the answer to that is going to be, it's a lot of personal preference. It's what you like the look of. Some people like the look of a longer tab sticking out. Some people like the look of a shorter tab sticking out. However, there's a few exceptions to this. If you have a big, bold design, something that doesn't have a lot of small detail in it, you can get away with having your tab stick out further from the edge of your page. If you are doing a design that has lots of small detail, either small lettering or small detail within your image, a lot of times, again, not always, but most of the time, a shorter tab depth, so something like this, where it's sticking out from the edge of the page less, is going to benefit you for a couple of reasons. When you have a longer tab depth, even though it's doubled up and even though it's holding itself in place using this method, those tabs, if they're super, super small and fine and skinny, are still not going to have a ton of structure to them. They're going to be better than if they were just sitting there, or better than having glue or tape on them, but they're still not going to have a ton of structure because they're so small. So the less that they stick out from the edge of the page, the less unstructured and the less wiggle that they're going to have. So sticking to a shallower depth is going to be better because they're not going to be able to move around as much and get tangled on each other as much, especially if you have a lot of them in a row. The other thing is, when you stand your book up and look at it, if you have a lot of small detail, especially in lettering, very small letters, what's going to happen is those longer depth tabs can actually cast a little bit of a shadow onto your image or onto the background or other pieces of your image. And it kind of plays with your eye a little bit and it puts things in a shadow that maybe shouldn't be. So it doesn't look as crisp or as clean as it would with a shallower tab that isn't going to cast that shadow as much. So that's something to keep in mind too. So for bigger, bolder designs, you can go a little bit longer with your tabs. For more detailed images, I would stick to a shallower depth tab. Now, personal preference wise, when I'm doing a 180 embossed fold, I never let my tab depth here exceed 0.5 centimeters, so 1/2 a centimeter. That's my personal preference. So I get that question a lot. How do I fold mine? My answer is, even on big, bold images, I don't let this tab depth exceed 0.5 centimeters. It's just how I do things. It doesn't matter whether it's into the text or not. I just don't like the look of the unstructured kind of tabs of having them get longer than that. This is the same formula that we were using before, but this piece of it, this deep minus shallow, whatever that value is, so if we bring this back, whatever this value ended up as, so this 0.8, that's actually going to be our tab depth once it's folded. So for me personally, who wants to keep it under or smaller than that 0.5, this 0.8, even if it had worked, which it didn't, but even if it had worked in this situation, I wouldn't do this anyway. I would choose a deeper depth for my shallow one to make this less of a difference. So if we look at our 1 centimeter, this 0.5 here, so the difference here, so the 1.5 minus 1, this 0.5, that would be okay for me. So that's personally something that I would fold. Now, if it had a lot of detail, I probably would stay away from this too, because again, my personal preference is to fold things with small detail to be less than this even. So for something with small detail, I would probably fold something closer to this, which would be the 1.5 minus 1.2. So we're left with 0.3, which again is less than 0.5. And 0.2 to 0.3 centimeters is really where I like to be for really complicated folds. Do I do 0.5 on complicated folds at times? I do. But for the most part, unless it's a pattern that I know is going to work with a slightly deeper 0.5 centimeter fold, I do tend to stick to the 0.2 or 0.3 centimeter depths for those tabs. So again, using the same formula that we used before, this piece of it, which you've already worked out in a previous step, can give you how deep that tab is going to be. So at 0.7, if we were to get a ruler and measure this, that tab would be 0.8 centimeters deep. So from the edge of the page out to the edge of this fold here, it would be 0.8 centimeters deep. Again, here the difference is 0.5 centimeters, and this would be 0.3 centimeters. And I know that that doesn't look like a lot. I know that that tab doesn't look like it sticks out very far, but I promise you that 0.2 to 0.3 centimeters, as long as they're folded nice, you're going to get that definition that you're looking for, and it's going to be nice and crisp and clean. So that's going to conclude this video. I hope that that helps you guys a little bit. I hope that I was able to kind of dial it back in and put it in a way that you guys are able to kind of plug your numbers in and get those really defined, crisp, clean folds that you guys are all looking for. As always, guys, I will put the link to my Facebook group in the description box below. It's a great place to go and ask questions if you have specific questions about your specific folds, or just general other book folding questions that you may have. Also, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It not only helps me put out new content for you guys and give you guys the content that you're looking for, but it also helps notify you guys when I do put a new video out, so that way, if it's something that you're needing or wanting to see, you get a notification that it's up.